that we've decided to diversify our panel based on.
So I'm mostly going to talk about my book, Inventing the Future, with Alex. When we started writing this book, it was going to be a purely sort of critical thing. It was basically looking at like the Occupy movements, looking at the anti-globalization movement, the anti-war movement, and sort of looking at why exactly had they failed in their efforts. You've had millions of people coming out protesting against these things, but they didn't seem to make any change. And so the idea was, what has gone wrong with this sort of form of organizing? And as we sort of researched it, we looked into it and we saw, well, one thing that was really missing was always this proper vision of an alternative future. And this is something that, like, in the 1960s, we had, these fantastic ideas of what the future might look like. Back in the 1920s, we had some amazing ideas. The Russian Revolution was saturated with these ideas of the future. So they were imagining back in the 1910s, well, let's go to Mars and have this communist utopia there where we don't have to work, where we've eliminated scarcity. And it was just, a fantastic sort of vision that could guide people who really wanted to change the world. And we didn't seem to have that anymore. So we started focusing more and more on like this lack of a vision, lack of a better future. And you see it in social democracy today. So when you look at something like even the Labour Party today, I like Corbyn, but he hasn't really put forth this proper alternative vision for what the future might look like. You look at something like the Democratic Party, the reason why they failed, why they lost to Trump, is because they were offering the same thing that everybody's already seen. Didn't have a big vision of the future. We look at trade unions, we see the same sort of thing. So we see them offering, well, let's go back to 1960s capitalism when we had growing wages, we had permanent jobs, these sorts of things. And then you've got like the radical academics, who if you want to make a good career, just critique everything. It's basically the best way to get a job, just be purely negative. So we wanted to put forth this idea of a better future. And I'm much more optimistic about things today than I was, say, 7 years ago when Alex and I first started writing the book. And that's because I think a lot of people are starting to think about what is the future and what might it look like, what is a utopian vision for what we want. So things are starting to change. We have people like Paul Mason talking about post-capitalism. We have people like Aaron Bastani talking about fully automated luxury communism, which is now mutated into like fully automated luxury space gay communism, which is fantastic. And then Alex and I had this idea of accelerationism as well as a sort of idea of what the future might look like. And I think one thing that we all accept is the idea that, well, the future has to involve a reduction in work. And part of this is based upon intrinsic capitalist tendencies. And so there was one question earlier about capitalism being, basically a good thing or a bad thing. Well, actually, Marx saw capitalism as a good thing in many ways. He saw it as developing the productive capacities of society. So the fact that we can produce so many goods now with so few people. 98% of us worked in farming 100 years ago, about 2% of us work in farming today. But we can feed more people with the amount of machinery that we have. So capitalism develops these productive capacities. That's a good thing, but at the same time, it ejects a group of people out. And Marx would talk about surplus populations as a group of people who are ejected from the capitalist system. They can't find jobs, and they're basically left to fend for themselves. And I think when we look around the world today, this is a lot of what we see. We see people living in informal labor markets, living in slums, trying to basically survive at the edges of society. They can't find proper formal jobs. This is the surplus population that Marx was talking about. Now today we see all these stories about robots taking jobs. And I think this is sort of these tendencies of capitalism now coming to roost within the rich countries. And basically, the middle class now seeing that actually their jobs may be disappearing, and what does that mean for them? So this is a real threat. I think that we're unlikely to see 50% unemployment or something like that. But I think we are likely to see a lot more unemployment and a lot more people doing, say, part-time jobs when they'd rather be working full-time, temporary jobs when they'd rather be working permanent jobs, all of these sorts of things. So how do we respond to that? And the traditional leftist way would have been, let's get them good jobs, permanent jobs, let's find them work to do. I don't think that works anymore. I don't think the economic system can enable it. So our argument is we have to start thinking about a post-work sort of society. So for us, this means 4 demands. One is full automation. which is admittedly a very polemical demand. You can't literally have full automation, but we do want to automate things that right now capitalism isn't automating, that are really terrible jobs, but it can find people, cheap laborers to do it. So look at a lot of the manufacturing done in China, people working in Foxconn where they've had to introduce suicide nets on the side of the buildings to keep people from killing themselves at work. Why do we have people doing those terrible jobs when we can automate it all? So full automation is sort of a push for to get some of these terrible jobs gone. Our second demand is a reduced working week. So I always suggest a 3-day weekend for everybody, which is, we already have long weekends and people love them. So we can already build off that sort of existing thing that we have. It also helps with climate change. So there was a study done in America where they looked at if we reduce the American working week down to the level of the average European working week, we would save about 20% of energy costs in America. So one less day of people commuting, one less day of factories running, one less day of offices running. This saves a huge amount of energy. And I think if we want to deal with climate change, we have to be talking about a reduced working week. Our third demand is for a universal basic income. So this is the idea that the government provides everybody with a basic amount of money that allows you to survive, no questions asked. So no conditionalities on it. It doesn't matter if you're looking for jobs. It doesn't matter if you went out to a party last night and had a whole bunch of drugs or anything. It doesn't matter. The government still gives you this money. So this allows people to then freely choose how they want to spend their time. If you want more money, you can go out and you can find a job, but you can choose to work, say, 10 hours. You can choose to work 40 hours. You can decide what you want. You have the freedom to make that choice. So on an individual level, it gives people a lot of power that they don't have right now. So if we're lucky, I think, we sometimes have a choice over which job to take, but unless we're independently wealthy, we don't have a choice over taking a job or not. With the basic income, we suddenly have that freedom, and I think that's a really important freedom. The final demand that we make in the book then is to reduce the reduce the work ethic. So the one issue that always comes up when I tell people about the sort of post-work idea is that, well, don't people love work? Isn't this, what we value as a society is work? I think that's absolutely right, but that's really problematic. So when you meet somebody for the first time, you ask them, what do you do? You never mean like, what are your hobbies? It's never like, oh, I practice guitar, practice musical skills in my free time or something. It's always, what is your job? That's what people mean. So this is, I think, really problematic. I think, the political hurdles, the economic hurdles of getting to a post-work society actually pale in comparison to the cultural hurdles. The fact that work is so central to our identity, the fact that, once you're done university, most of your friend networks and most of the people that you meet are going to be through work. So it's central to our social identity, and this is really, it's difficult to imagine an alternative society that isn't based so centrally on work. And I think this is, it's hopefully something we can do tonight, is start to think about, what would a society that isn't so premised upon a job, what does that look like in terms of, meeting people, in terms of your identity and things like that. So that is sort of the post-work world that I think we can imagine, and I think increasingly it's necessary that we have to start thinking about how we build this sort of society. Maybe I'll leave it at that. So UBI, there's been a number of different people who've looked at the actual figures in the UK. They range in estimates from about £70 a month to about, £70 a week to about £200 a week. And that would involve mostly raising income taxes a bit, not for middle class or below, but just on the highest, people who make a lot of money. I quite like the idea of also introducing like a proper carbon tax, and then that way we can knock off climate change and fund a UBI at the same time, which seems like quite a good idea. There's another aspect as well, which is, so increasingly governments tax income, the money that we make from doing a job, but they don't tax people who have wealth. So when you own a fancy thing, you don't pay a lot of tax on it. If you own a big business, you don't pay a lot of tax on it. Look at Apple, look at Uber, all these companies who pay barely any taxes. So part of the thing is, as well, is that we should also be raising taxes on these companies and raising taxes on the people who basically own Britain at the moment. And we can fund it through that. I think, to give you a sort of annual figure, it's estimated we could get about £6,000 a year at the moment, which wouldn't be enough, obviously, to survive in London. But it would bring everybody who's in poverty right now, which is actually a lot of people who are working, it would be able to bring them all out of poverty. And it also then gives you, say if you are making 20,000 a year at the moment, it gives you the opportunity to work less and make that sort of choice. And then we can start building it up from there, would be my idea. There's two aspects. One is, from my perspective, writing from a Western country, now deindustrialized country, there's a particular sort of task that I see we could be doing and should be doing in Britain. I do think a sort of post-work world holds globally, though, and I think a post-gender world quite clearly could hold globally as well. There's a lot of movements against work in other countries. And one of the first things that capitalism has to do is basically tell people that are working off the land and surviving on their own, it has to force them off the land and force them into factories and turn them into wage laborers and proletariat. So people resist that. People don't want to be a worker for capitalism, and that I think still is retained in a lot of places. The other sort of aspect is as well is that a country like China or India or Nigeria or Brazil, all these countries are fairly industrialized. I mean, particularly China. And the threat of automation is actually going to impact them even more. So the estimates that I've seen, the highest one I've seen is Ethiopia actually. 85% of jobs in Ethiopia right now could be automated within 2 decades. So this is a huge amount of jobs that could be taken away. And I think if we want to start thinking about a better world, it can't be one premised upon work and jobs. It has to be something which is rejecting that sort of work ethic. Now that being said, I don't think it can be, what we do in the UK is going to necessarily be different from Ethiopia, from China, even from Germany or the US. It's going to be different in each particular circumstance. But I do think post-work stuff has a lot of validity. Yeah, I think this is a really difficult question. I think it comes down to political strategy, and I think given the current foreseeable future, states are going to be here. And in terms of our political actions, states are the sort of container within which we act. I think we should be pushing for open borders, though, completely open borders, the same way that I can go from London to Manchester without any blockages beyond like getting a car or a train. You should be able to do that around the world. So I'm completely in favor of that, and I think a major political project in the coming decades, particularly once we start having climate change refugees and all this sort of stuff, the borders are going to be locked up. They're already locked up. 5,000 people dying a year in the Mediterranean. So we need to open up borders more, and I think that's a major project. I think we still need the state, though. The state is the state without nationalism is the sort of way I think about it, which leaves the state as like this administrative function. So the state minus the coercive apparatus, minus the nationalism that involves these exclusions between who's us and who's the foreigners that aren't allowed in. So how do we think the state in that sort of way? I think the state is necessary in terms of taxation. How do we collect taxes? How do we collect billions of tax revenues to distribute for UBI? I can't imagine it without the state. Maybe somebody else can, but I can't at the moment. So this is why I still think it's functionally necessary, even if we want to get rid of some of its worst aspects. One thing I want to talk about as well is emergency thinking, which maybe is the opposite of like utopian thinking, where it's just we have a crisis and we immediately have to act. And the result is you end up giving up on some principles in order to like save people in the here and now. A really good example is something like the discourse in the Labour Party at the moment, where you've got this idea that to become electable, the Labour Party has to give in to some xenophobia, has to like throw the migrants under the bus. And that's a short-term sort of thing. And then the other group of people are arguing, well, actually, we want to change that entire discourse. We don't want to be hating on immigrants. But that's not going to, help elections in 2020 or whenever they are. So there's always this emergency thinking like we have to do something right now, which ends up giving up on principles. I think with long-term thinking and with strategic thinking, we can at least judge when it's right to give up on a principle for short-term gain and when it's not. So I think strategy is necessary.